Kia ora koutou, welcome to the Happy Revolution podcast. My name is Rayne, and this week I am joined by my co-host Mika as we chat with Dr. Chris Marshall. Chris is now retired, but he spent decades working in academia, particularly focusing on restorative justice, and has worked at Herenga Waka for a number of years, teaching Paul in religious studies and then working in the School of Governance in the area of restorative justice. Mika, myself and Chris talk about restorative justice and the role of forgiveness within society and the church and the biblical figure of Paul and a bunch of other really interesting things. I really loved this conversation. It was particularly special to us because we'd never met Chris before, we don't know him, and he said yes to being interviewed by us and gave us a lot of his time and effort, which was really lovely. So we're very thankful for the conversation and we hope you all enjoy it as much as we did.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps we can start by, you can tell us a bit about your background, how you came to be a lecturer and how you came to be where you are now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I was born in Wellington, so this is my hometown. I did my degree at Vic back in the 1970s in anthropology and geography, so it was not the field I ended up in. I was always interested in theological study, partly emerging out of our student days here where it was very active. The Christian community here was very active and very vibrant. And so I went secondary school teaching for a year, and after that I decided to do some theological study, which I did by distance from Melbourne in 3 years. Then I applied to go to London University to do a PhD in New Testament. The person who put me onto the person I studied was Lloyd Gearing, who used to teach in here religious studies at Vic. And Graham Stanton was a Kiwi who is now the Professor of New Testament at London. So he put me onto him. Did that, came back in 81 to a position at what's now called Laidlaw College in Auckland, where I taught for nearly 20 years in New Testament studies and theology, New Testament theology and ethics. Then I got a position back here at Vic in the religious studies program. They had some funding, external funding, and they decided to create a dedicated position in theology, which is a bit of a departure for religious studies because it was kind of created over against theology. So this was the more sort of external look at religion compared to the more confessional approach in theology. So that the two fields really stood in some tension, but there was some funding available to create a position in Christian theology. I was actually approached to apply for it. I had looked at the job and thought they wouldn't be interested in me. They'd be wanting somebody a bit different than me. But they approached me and asked me to apply, so I did. And I got appointed to a position called the St. John's Senior Lectureship in Christian Theology, I think it was. So I came back to Wellington in 2004 and was in Raleigh for 10 years. And it was great. It was quite a shift in terms of the classroom environment that I was used to, but I was doing the same thing. I taught a course on Jesus and a course on Paul, which are the two areas which I usually taught in. And then I've been interested in restorative justice for a long time and had worked in that field, and there was funding available to create a chair in restorative justice. So that was created in 2013. So I moved from up here at Kelburn down to the School of Government, took up this position and had that role for almost 8 years. And then I retired at the end of 2020. So that's a brief snapshot. So I guess my life has been occupied with biblical studies and biblical scholarship, New Testament scholarship, and restorative justice as a kind of outworking of what I think the New Testament talks about when it's talking about God's justice, the outworking of that in the public arena. So I guess some people would know me as the New Testament person, other people would know me as an RJ person and be quite surprised that I've got this older side to my life, but they've always been closely connected. So.
Can you tell us a bit about what restorative justice is and what that looks like and some of the work that you've done in that area?
Yeah. So the modern restorative justice movement began about 40 years ago in Canada and in the US, and has spread around the world since then. I say modern restorative justice because you could argue that most smaller communities have used restorative ways of dealing with harm, and that the kind of exception has been the modern state-centred punitive adversarial system that we take for granted. So there is in the restorative justice area, there was a kind of debate about where did this stuff begin, and some claim it began in indigenous communities and it's been co-opted, and others claim that it began within the conventional system as an alternative. So it's kind of debated territory. But what we now call the restorative justice movement, in my view, did begin in Canada in 74, I think it was. And it's quite an interesting story because there were a couple of Christian, one was a probation officer, the other was a sort of community service kind of person, who were looking for a way of being a more peacemaking presence in what is arguably the most violent social institution we have, the criminal justice system. And there were a couple of young men who were up for vandalising about 24 or 25 houses in a small town in Ontario. And the probation officer and the other man came up with this idea of asking the judge whether they could take these young guys around to meet their victims. And the judge said that was okay. So they took these boys around and they knocked on every door of the house that they had vandalised. Got a variety of responses from the victims, as you would expect. But the conversations focused on what can you do to put this right? How can you repair the damage you've done? And then they reappeared before the judge, and he made reparation that they'd agreed to as a condition of their sort of probation. And that was such a successful experience and such a kind of mind-opening experience that out of that developed a program which was known as Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, VORP for short. And all this was taking place within a Christian setting. These were Mennonite church workers who were coming from a tradition that was really committed to peacemaking and to reconciliation. And they were looking for ways in which they could bring this into sort of mainstream society. And so it was out of that kind of wellspring of understanding about peacemaking that this program developed. And again, it was very successful. It was a simple idea of bringing the victims of an offence and the perpetrator of the offence together with a mediator to talk about what's happened and what can be done to address it positively. And the program flourished, it grew and spread through Canada and the US. Then people in Europe started noticing this and taking interest in it. And then in the early 1980s, the person who was most instrumental in kind of providing the theoretical or intellectual structure for this program, this research that would support it, landed on the term restorative justice to describe it. He wasn't the first to use this term, but he's the first to use it in connection with this kind of process. And that name has stuck. And so all around the world now, that's the term restorative justice. Now, the term itself creates problems for people because they don't know what you mean when you talk about restorative justice. Nonetheless, it is the term that is stuck. And again, I think that's a kind of interesting thing. That why is it this idea or this name has become so acceptable all around the world? I mean, RJ programs are in over 100 countries around the world now. So it's something that began a very small-scale experimental program in small-town Canada, and it's gone right up to the United Nations and Council of Europe and so on, have sort of passed remits encouraging countries to develop restorative alternatives. So I became interested in it in the early 80s. Then in the early 90s, I was given the first book in this area by a man called Howard Zehr. And I read this book and I thought, this is really quite impressive. So Howard Zehr is a criminal justice historian, a Mennonite, and he was really providing the kind of explanation for what this work was about. But he had a chapter on biblical justice. And I was interested in that. I wasn't really interested in the larger criminal justice stuff because I had no experience in that area. But I read the whole book and I was really quite impressed by it and made quite a deep impression on me. And so I wrote a review of this book. It was published in a journal called Stimulus here. And the publishers of the journal, such was the interest in the review because people sort of responded to it. There was a prison chaplain and there was a judge and various other people responded to the review, that they decided to convene a conference here in Wellington in 1994 called Making Crime Pay, because at that stage there was this upsurge in sort of right-wing attitudes towards criminal justice issues, and so it was really it was live topic. And Howard Zale was invited out to speak at the conference, and I was invited to speak at the conference. In fact, I was asked to speak on what the New Testament has to say about crime and justice. And I can literally remember thinking, well, that would be pretty easy because the New Testament, as far as I can tell, doesn't say anything about it. But I'll have a go, and I did have a go, and I discovered that there's a lot more there than I'd realised. And so I presented this paper. That paper grew into a book, became a book later, 2001. And out of that kind of theological work and this kind of engagement with Howard and with other people who are working in the criminal justice sector, I ended up training as a restorative justice facilitator and working in that field for the last 25 years. That's my personal story. Now, what is it? What do we mean by this? So, again, as with most things that are relatively new, there's lots of different ways of describing this process. And I think universal agreement on the kind of principles that inform the process, but people will define it in slightly different ways. So the way I would define it is it's a voluntary relational process where people who have been directly involved in some harmful event, such as a crime, come together with the help of facilitators to talk about what's happened, to talk about what's led up to the event, what the impact of the event has been on their lives, what needs it has created in their lives, because it always does. Trauma always creates a set of needs that need to be addressed, and what can be done on the part of the person or people responsible. What can they begin to do to try and repair the damage? So the notion of restorative is about trying to repair the harm, but also restoring the kind of the mana and the dignity of the people involved. And that's it, really. I mean, it's a kind of guided conversation that has a kind of broad structure. And the structure is around what's happened, what's the impact been, what needs have been created, what can we do to repair it. Very simple. I mean, you think we should always do this. I mean, when you have a conversation, you always have those sorts of questions, but we don't tend to do that. What we tend to go is who's guilty and what do we need to do to them to sort of show that they've done wrong. And so it's, in a sense, a very simple process, but it's informed, I think, by this relational commitment to repair the harm that has been done at a personal, moral, psychological, as well as material level. And it is remarkably powerful in a way that, still can leave you, it's not always like this, of course, but can still leave you just kind of speechless at what you just witnessed. And I've thought a lot about why it is so powerful. What is it about this kind of conversation that is can be so transformative? And I think there's a lot of ways of answering that. But I think most fundamentally, it's about acknowledging the value of the person that has been harmed and acknowledging the continuing value of the person who has done the harm in a way that addresses this deep sense of being devalued by what's happened, being not cared about, being treated as as just something whose meaning and values and feelings don't count. And there's something about being able to reaffirm that to a person that helps to heal the damage. So. And for me, what I've discovered, particularly over the last 10 years or so, and this is part of a larger shift or expansion of the field, really, because it began in the criminal justice area, but it's kind of ricocheted out to all sorts of other areas of social life, particularly in schools, but also into organisational life and into every way in which people are engaged in some kind of relational setting. That this is a process that has applications to a huge range of areas, and so even though haven't been personally involved in the criminal justice stuff for a year or two now, I still find all kinds of places where this kind of conversation makes a difference.
You're talking about the Christian roots of restorative justice, and some of the study that you've done into what the New Testament has to say about justice. Can you speak more about some of that biblical connection?
Yeah. I think this has been perhaps the most transformative insight for me, and has led me to be able to rethink a lot of things that have caused sort of discomfort in the past. So I think that the fundamental insight is that God's justice, God's attempt to put right what has been damaged in creation, is fundamentally redemptive. It's fundamentally a healing process. It's an attempt to restore. It's not simply an attempt to punish and to judge and to exclude. And for most people today, when you think of the notion of justice, you tend to think of an adversarial process that's about deciding who has done wrong and what penalty do they need to suffer. And that is somehow about doing justice. Whereas in Scripture in general, justice is about restoring relationships to health. And so a punitive dimension may be involved in it, but that's not the end game. The end game is to put the relationship back into a rightful state. And that applies to humanity at large in terms of being restored to the position that God intended humanity to operate in, or to be in relationship to God and in relationship to creation, that being put right. But it also applies to individual harms that occur. So, when you get to the New Testament, that seems to be fundamentally what's going on. I wrote a book once called Compassionate Justice, which is really a very close analysis of the two most famous parables in the New Testament. And I should try this, but it probably wouldn't be the case now, but because you went out in the street and asked people, name a parable, or have you ever heard of the parable of Jesus, they probably wouldn't know how to respond. But once upon a time, almost everybody would have heard of the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it just dawned on me when I was working on the parable of the prodigal son, for other reasons. I didn't go into expecting to find a restorative sort of way of understanding it, but it just occurred to me, this is a parable about the restoration of an offender. Serious offence, harm is done, the return and the father's attempt to restore this child to an honoured position back in the community. And the Good Samaritan is a parable about trying to restore a victim of crime, beaten up on the streets and left for dead, encountered by the two sort of legal figures, the priest and the Levite, who put their legal duties over against the responsibility to care for the victim, then by the stranger. And these are the stories that Jesus offers. I guess the most powerful story Jesus offers is tell us what God is like. And if you look at it through a restorative framework, the God that Jesus is telling us about is a restorative God. I used to say to radio students here, imagine if God actually was like the father of the prodigal son. Imagine if that was actually true. What a difference that would make to the way people perceive God. And I guess we have it on best authority that that's what God is like, because this is what Jesus offers. So the first way I kind of got into the theological reflection on the New Testament stuff was actually through Paul. So the Apostle Paul uses a lot of metaphors when he tries to understand the work of the death and resurrection of Christ, what we call in the trade the atonement. So a lot of metaphors, but the one that he uses most extensively in Romans and Galatians in particular, but the one that he really uses most thoroughly is the justice metaphor. So he talks about being justified by faith. I mean, the connection with justice is obvious when you point it out. And so I started trying to think about, what does Paul mean by God doing justice through the cross and us being justified, being restored to a just condition, if we look at the justice from a restorative rather than a retributive angle? And it just made so much sense. Whereas the way in which many Christians, and the way in which has been pretty well dominant over the last 400 or 500 years when it comes to explaining the work of the cross, is to see it as a work of punitive justice. God has to punish sin. God loves us. He can't punish us because he'll destroy his creation. So he's got a problem. God's got to punish because justice says you've got to punish, but God loves and God wants to forgive. So what does he do? Comes up with this brilliant idea of a substitutionary sacrifice. So Christ comes, bears the punishment, and then God's free to forgive. And I think there's all sorts of problems with that way of understanding it. It's almost universal, really, in churches. Whereas if the notion is God wants to restore to relationship those who have been victimized by sin and have been caught in the power of sin and therefore have also helped to extend sin, and God wants to restore, and his justice is satisfied and the relationship is put right, then the death of Christ looks quite different as a means of doing that. Jesus enters into the state of those who are caught up in the problem. He shares in the state, and he is able to absorb the the damage that sin's been done, and then to sort of offer restoration. And just all made a lot more sense to me. Although the first thing I wrote on this, I got into trouble because people got very, very nervous about questioning penal substitution as the fundamental theme. But yes, I think there's a lot there. Now, there's a lot of stuff there as well about final judgment and about punishment and so on, and all that stuff I've tried to struggle with, and it's part of the picture as well. But I think the fundamental drive in the biblical story, from the very word go, from the expulsion from Eden to the New Jerusalem where the gates are always left open, is all about God attempting to heal and restore. And Jesus' own ministry was about healing and restoring and including. And so that's restorative justice. That's exactly what restorative justice is about. So you would think that most Christians ought to respond to this stuff reading the text, and most do. But I guess one of the things that I've been a wee bit disappointed about over the last 20 or 30 years that I've been involved in this work is, although this was born in a Christian setting and was informed by Christian values and informed by the theology of shalom, by the idea of peace being sort of wholeness and well-being, by and large churches haven't taken it very much further. It's moved from the sort of ecclesial setting where it was born into the secular arena, and it's now largely carried forward by government agencies and government policy and government funding. And most churches have been very, very slow, if they even know about it, to get involved in the practice. And the part I guess I'm more disappointed, slower to recognise the theological rewards that come from thinking about God and the work of the cross and the work of Jesus and the theme of justice in the Bible, which is so prominent, hundreds of references to God's justice, to think about this in restorative terms, and is still pretty locked into the idea that justice means judgment. So there's some work to do, I think, still, but yeah.
In the context of all of these conversations around restorative justice, and with some of your work as a restorative justice facilitator, do you have any visions for reform in the current criminal justice system, and what could taking a more restorative approach look like? Yeah, particularly as someone who's studying criminal law at the moment, and you see a lot of this sort of very adversarial, how do we put this person through this step-by-step process? What sort of tests can we apply to punish them and find them guilty for different crimes? And then how do we sentence them and punish them based on the way we evaluate the harm that they've done. And that seems to me like that sort of approach and that understanding shifts completely when you take a more restorative approach.
Yeah, it does, because you're approaching the issue much more in terms of the relational dynamics than the kind of factual. What's tended to happen in all these kinds of alternative justice mechanisms is we fiddle around the edges. So we kind of expand the tent a wee bit to allow mediation to occur, or therapeutic processes to occur in court, or restorative justice to occur. But the system remains fundamentally adversarial. And I mean, will that ever change in our lifetime? Who knows? I mean, I'm not all that optimistic. And I'm not optimistic because you may remember 5 years ago, the Labour government came to power, and one of its clarion calls was, we're going to overhaul the justice system. And they were very serious about it. And they did, they sent people out around the country talking, particularly to communities that are most affected by harm. And there was a strong cry, especially from Maori communities, we need a transformative justice system rather than a punitive one, because our communities are being damaged by the way the process works. And all that stuff was put in reports and was submitted to the government. And then, second Labour term, ministers changed jobs. And as far as I can sense, the steam's gone out of it. And so, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things happening. I have friends that work in MOJ, and so I'm sure there's a lot of things going on within the sector to try and improve the current system, but it remains just a tinkering, really. And when Labour announced the idea of overhauling the system, and I started thinking, well, what? Because this is the day we've been waiting for. RJ, asking the right questions. We've got quite a lot of experience in this country in restorative justice. We're known internationally as the kind of leader in this field. Well, here's our chance to actually make a difference. And I thought, well, okay, if I was in their role, what would I do? And I because I know it's really complex, and I got lawyers in the family, I know the system can't be changed easily, and there's a lot of good things about our system. But I think if I had been asked, what do you think restorative justice, how can we be helped by this at this stage, I'd have suggested what we need to do as a country is have a kind of mantra about what justice is about. And what is the justice system for? And I think from a restorative perspective, I would say we want a justice system that repairs the harm. And I would have thought that the electorate would have bought that. Who doesn't want a system that repairs? I mean, particularly for victims, it repairs the harm to them, but also repairs the harm to the communities, but also seeks to repair the harm to the perpetrator. I mean, to me, again, it makes perfect sense. And I think it's one that would have political legs if they had embraced it. They went for the idea of a transformative justice system, and there's a whole story around that, but I don't think that quite has the same purchase, really. So in terms of the current system, I think the first thing would be to try and I think it does come down to a kind of, I was going to say cliche, not really, but a kind of, what's the word, a kind of byline. The whole neoliberal economic reform was around a kind of byline of, private sector can do it better kind of stuff. We do need a kind of idea, a master idea that people could relate to, and it could actually guide policy. And I think the idea of justice as repair would do that, because that doesn't rule out punishment, because there's a repair to the kind of moral values that community upholds, and that's what the punitive system claims to be about. So it doesn't exclude the possibility of punishment, but it would say that really, when you look at policy, we look at what we're doing, if it's not repairing the harm, then it's not doing justice. And if you had that lens and you applied it to, say, the prison system, then you've got a problem. We've got a system we invest billions of dollars in, and it's not repairing. So that would be the first thing. I think it would need a very committed and informed minister to do that. But I think it could have been done. Apart from that, we're left with tinkering. We're left with trying to make the thing a little less damaging. And I think the one thing that we could do better in this country is broaden the range of places where a restorative process can occur. So at the moment, it largely, in terms of funding, and I guess 90% of the work in the criminal system takes place in the pre-sentence space. So between a guilty plea and sentence, in that 6 weeks or 2 months, whatever long the period is, there is funding available for the victim and offender should they both choose to do this, to have this kind of conversation. Most countries put the effort into either stuff in prison or after prison. We don't. And I think if we were to be more serious about restorative responses, we would allow a restorative process to occur at any stage in what do they call the justice pipeline, at any stage in that pipeline. I think we do a lot more around reintegration, where we think of person released from prison. Well, they're released from prison, but what they're released into, we can talk about jobs and accommodation and things like that as part of the process as well. But they're also released into a community from which they have been alienated. So what can we do to try and restore them into the community and for the community to actually welcome them back properly? Again, like the parable of the prodigal son, through a feast. Best robes, rings, and so on. So, there are lots of things we could do to improve the harm that our current system does. But, I'm not optimistic that we'll do more than just slightly improve it. I mean, people have sort of theorised about what a system could look like were the commitment to restorative values there. And essentially what the system would look like is that the first response will always be to try and provide a restorative way of dealing with it. And only if the parties are not prepared to do that, or if there's dispute over guilt, there's issues that need to be addressed around responsibility, do you have the kind of backstop of an adversarial process or an inquisitorial one? Whereas at the moment, their first response is adversarial. As you say, it's all about sort of working out, does it reach the threshold of being a crime, and is really about how the law can be honoured in the process. Having that as your first stop, and then adding a few little restorative stuff on the side for those who want it. So that's the long and the short of the answer.
Kind of sounds like a long process, restorative justice. What is the average time of this?
Well, I mean, it does vary, and I think when we first started doing this, we did, in the group that I was part of in Auckland, we did keep a log of time just to get some sense of what it was costing. And I would think that probably the average kind of case would be 12 to 15 hours maybe, which is a lot more than a 10-minute appearance in court for sentencing. And so at first glance, you think, wow, that's quite an expensive way to do it. And that's one of the objections towards all alternative processes. It takes more time to actually sit down and have a conversation and to really listen to people and to really investigate what the harm has been and to really think about what can be done to repair. It's much easier just to say guilty, yes, well then, the kind of the tariff is this or that. But long-term investing at that level, it would save you a lot of money down the line. It costs over $100,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. So, and the kind of work that has been done by economists to try and work out what the savings are to the system. It's like I can never remember the exact ratio. It's like a 6 or 8 to 1 saving. So every dollar you spend in restorative justice, you save $8 in the mainstream system, because the mainstream system, just employing a judge, costs $1 million a year. So while it is time consuming, because it is about relational respect, I think longer term is a cheaper way to go. But then you can have cases that are much more succinct than that, and you can have other cases that require a lot more work. So it's a bit of an unknown, really, when you enter into a case. Because the problem is that you can't prejudge how severely affected a person has been. It might look like a trivial wrongdoing, but it could well trigger things in the person's life that they're more harmful than... I mean, the story I sometimes tell, because lots of stories come to mind when I start talking about this thing, but when I was first getting involved in this work, I remember one case in Auckland And this sort of crime probably happens 1,000 times a day. A couple had their house burgled. So a suburban street in Auckland, somebody broken into the house, and when they were ransacking the house and seeing things, the owners of the house drove back up the drive. And the young guy who was doing it, had just been released from prison actually, had met somebody on the street, and they said, why don't we just knock off a house? And they did. And the car drove up, they panicked, and they started trying to get out the windows, and the person walked into the house and they threw a bottle of wine at them to try and, because they were stealing some wine. And they got out of the house and ran away, and the police caught them. And so it was burglary. And you think, well, it's a burglary. I mean, we've probably all been burgled at some stage. But when we brought the young man and his mother together with the woman of the house, the husband didn't come to talk about what happened. This young guy learned something about this event that he would never learned otherwise. And that was that this couple, probably about my age, had just come back from a weekend away, knowing that that'd probably be the last time that they would be able to do that, because the husband was terminally ill and he was dying. And so this young man realised that he hadn't just broken into a house and stolen some bottles of wine. He'd actually traumatised people who are going through some of the most traumatic experiences, or about to go through the most traumatic experience of their life. And you could see the impact of that, just the shame and the horror of having done that. So, so you can't always judge what the impact has been. And so then you've got to put at the time, and if there's more serious stuff that needs to be addressed.
You've mentioned that some of the debates around restorative justice is that it has been kind of co-opted from Indigenous communities. Can you talk more about that and maybe expand a bit more on what restorative justice looks like, particularly in the broader Aotearoa New Zealand context?
Yeah, again, the term restorative justice itself is not one that is necessarily embraced. And the reason for that is partly because restorative justice, say, let's talk about the New Zealand situation, has been identified very much with the value conferencing model, which has sometimes been presented as an Indigenous sort of whānau-based kind of model that has been colonised by the state and, has not actually honoured the basic kind of relational values that lie at the heart of Māori justice. And so the term restorative justice is a wee bit contaminated by that. And so the term that has been often used is transformative justice. And transformative justice is a kind of parallel field to RJ. And when people have championed this notion of transformation, they have been saying that we need something that goes beyond just the meeting of these individuals to restore the harm. We need to address the kind of contextual harm or the historical harm. And that's about transformation. And so I think that's, if they use any language at all, any sort of label at all, it's often around transformational kind of conversations and transformational processes. Well, having said that, in the US, where everything is now controlled by racial justice issues, restorative justice is the term that's often been used to address that, and understood, as I would understand it, as being a much more holistic approach rather than just the very focused approach on individual harm. And there's a sense in which New Zealand's been on this journey now for 30 or 40 years, and I think the way the Waitangi Tribunal works and so on is kind of like a restorative process. I mean, it's not like that in other ways because of the lawyers involved and the historians involved and so on. But I think the concern is to identify harm, to own the harm, to apologise for harm, to do something to restore the loss, restore the mana. So that's a kind of restorative process. So, but I guess the warning that Indigenous critics have, and it's a really important warning, is that there is always a danger, more than a danger, a reality, that when government takes something on board, funds it, and tries to control it, that it will get stripped of its radical edge. It will be domesticated by that process. And so you have a kind of paradoxical situation where you want government to do this, and you want the system to be more reparative and more healing in its focus. But the moment the government does attempt to do it, fiscal and political and public sector kind of constraints start to steer the ship. And so the critique that indigenous scholars in particular offer from long and bitter experience is that this will be co-opted, it'll be corrupted, it'll be reduced to the bare minimum, and it won't live up to the promise of the first designers of this process. And that is a really important critique, and it's one that I think we just have to live with, because there's no simple answers to it. You can say, well, let's just not have anything to do with the state and do it on the side, and then you say, well, you're abandoning the majority of people to a harmful process. Or you say, let's try and change the system, knowing that as you do that, you'll end up selling your mess of pottage, selling your inherited mess of pottage, to use an old King James phrase. And so I don't see that it's either or. It's got to be both, but you've got to be aware of the tension.
What role do you think restorative justice could play within the university setting, particularly speaking to us as students?
Yeah. Well, you might not know this, but we're supposed to be a restorative university.
Oh, I did not know that.
So one of the things that we did, we being the chair of restorative justice, which I held, and the team around me, is that we started to sell the idea to the university of branding itself as a restorative university. And it was embraced as an idea. There are posters around the place, but all these things, tend to ebb over time. But it's mainly expressed itself in the area of student misconduct. So even now, if a student is hauled before the student conduct committee, which I actually used to chair here, the idea is to try and use a restorative process. So, and that happens a lot, actually. It's happened in the halls where lots of bad things happen. And so the student area in the university, the people who still run that are trained restorative practitioners, and they're very committed to restorative process. The harder thing is moving it into the HR area. And again, there's been, we have done quite a bit of explanation and selling this to HR. And there is now, we established it about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. There's a service that the university contracts from the chair called EAS, Employment Advisory and Something Services, Employment Advisory and Resolution Services. And so if there is a staff issue where there's been conflict, or where there's universities full of broken relationships, they can explore the possibility of using a restorative process to address the harm. So there is work going on in the university, and when we first presented this idea, it was embraced quite strongly as a way of marking the distinctiveness of the university, because there are universities around the world, especially in the US, that are using restorative processes in terms of sexual misconduct. But I think I didn't know any other university at the time that said, no, we want to actually be a restorative university, more generally than that. But it's a big beast, 1,600 staff or something, and there's 20,000 students. It's a small town out there, and it's a big ship to shift. But if you were to go and speak to the provost or some of the senior people, they would embrace the idea of using restorative tools.
Another question that I have, just as a side note, just because I'm curious, can you talk a bit about the role of forgiveness in the restorative justice process? Because forgiveness is often a core Christian value and is a core part of our faith, but so often it also can be kind of, when it's forced, it can kind of be used as a weapon to force or manipulate a victim to a resolution. And I was just wondering how we talk about forgiveness within the restorative justice process.
Yeah. So the relationship between forgiveness and justice is a bit complicated, because when restorative justice began as the victim offender reconciliation project, there was a kind of assumption that this was aimed at reconciling the parties, and that reconciliation would be fulfilled in the offer of forgiveness. I've discovered that forgiveness is the F word, really, in many circles. And so I think the way I've explained it in my writing is that restorative justice is on the way to forgiveness, but it's not about forgiveness. It's not trying to create forgiveness, because forgiveness is a voluntary offer of grace, and you can't manufacture it, you can't demand it, you can't sort of manipulate it into existence. But I think when you think of the impact of being harmed or of causing harm, it is only ultimately arriving at a place of forgiveness where the legacy of the harm is finally addressed. Because if a person feels unable to forgive, or at whatever part of the spectrum you enter into, because forgiveness can be quite a long and slow journey, but if they feel that they're unable to forgive, or they refuse to forgive, or refuse to contemplate the possibility of forgiving, and that's not uncommon, I will never forgive you, then in a sense what they're saying is that you're going to continue to have an impact on my life for the rest of time. Every time I think about you, I'm going to feel the sense of stress, the sense of resentment, the sense of hatred, the sense of harm, and you're going to continue to have power over me. So forgiveness is, I think, is the culmination of a restorative process, but it's not one that you expect or demand or even request. I'm not even sure whether it's okay. Maybe it's all right to ask somebody to forgive you, but when you ask somebody to forgive you, you are putting a kind of pressure on them that they often might not know how to respond to. But forgiveness, I think forgiveness is, I use the metaphor in the very last paragraph of one of my books that, when the ship of justice reaches home port, that's when forgiveness has occurred. And that is a kind of miracle. I mean, being able to let go and not to nurture resentment or hurt, it is a kind of miracle. Although I've got some other thoughts about that. I mean, I've always described forgiveness as being a kind of gift of grace that comes to us from beyond, and we receive it and are able to. And I think very often we experience it like that. But I've also come to realise that you often can't forgive until certain needs have been met within you. And those needs include often explanation for what happened, some sense of remorse for having caused the harm, some way in which you've shown that the harm you've caused has also caused you to suffer. There are certain needs that we have when we're harmed that need to be addressed in order to clear the way for this miracle to occur. And often the apology process, when it's done properly, helps to do that. So when a person can't forgive, they say, I just can't forgive, I guess the question I'd have in my mind is, what more do you need? What more do you need that hasn't been addressed? Have you received the information that you need about the event? Has this person shown that they feel remorseful? Are there things you need to do in terms of coping with your own sort of loss that you haven't been able to attend to? Rather than saying you must forgive. I think Desmond Tutu, who's written a book about forgiveness, says that if somebody has done wrong and says, I'm sorry, then he said, my gospel tells me I must forgive. And I think when you look at the teaching of Jesus on forgiveness, then there is a kind of obligation, I think, for those who follow him to be open to enter into this process that will lead to forgiveness. And that can be quite disturbing for people. I was once at a conference on domestic violence, I think it was, and there was a panel on the stage of people who worked in the sort of family violence area. And the question of forgiveness came up, and the person who was chairing this saw me in the audience. I knew him. He had known that I'd written a wee bit on this, and he said, Chris, can you make a comment on forgiveness? And I saw this look go across the face of one of the people on the panel who was, an advocate for victims. And the look that went across her face was, don't you dare. Don't you dare use the F word in this context. And I understand why that was there, the chocolates and sort of flowers approach that doesn't really address the harm. I understand that perfectly. But on the other hand, if you rule out forgiveness, if you say to a person, you have no obligation to think about this, or this is not something that you need to worry about, you have every right to feel resentful, every right to sort of all the burden back on the person who's harmed you. If you have that approach, then I think you're robbing the person of the possibility of ultimate healing. So I think there is this kind of tension between, it's got to be free, you can't demand it, you can't feel guilty about the fact that you can't get there, with knowing that ultimately forgiveness, I think, is the key to restoration.
I don't know how to ask this question, but I'm just kind of curious. You've talked already about penal substitution as kind of the dominant narrative for Jesus' death and resurrection. In that narrative, from what I understand, Jesus has taken the wrath of God on himself in the cross. But also God still does need to forgive us as humans, as humanity. What role does forgiveness play in the restorative justice framework from God's perspective? Does he still need to forgive us, or is the work still done in Jesus in a different way? I'm not really sure what my question is exactly, but...
Well, if I understand what you're asking, is forgiveness purchased by punishment? Does God forgive us because he's already been able to punish the sin? And that's been the way I think people tend to think about it, that God had this problem of wrongdoing that needed to be punished. And until that happened, God wasn't free to forgive. And the problem with that is forgiveness, by definition, is free. It's not earned. So I think I haven't completely got this one taped, I must say, but I think that forgiveness accompanies the work of the cross. It's not that the work of the cross enabled forgiveness to happen, because I think God's attitude towards us is one of constant forgiveness. I mean, there's a kind of metaphor of the sun. The sun always shines. The sun doesn't come up in the morning and just switch on. It's always there. It's always shining. But it's often concealed by the clouds of the day. And I think God's forgiveness is a bit like that. God is constantly forgiving. I mean, Ephesians talks about God being rich in mercy, just, more than he needs. That God's attitude is always one of wanting to forgive, the way that, a loving parent wants to forgive all the time. But we're not always able to receive that. We're not always able to enter into it because of this problem of this kind of captivity of the soul to what the Bible calls sin, which is more than just wrong deeds. It's this kind of distortion within human experience that alienates us from that experience. So I think when it's talk about forgiveness through the atonement, I think it's that God's forgiveness becomes transparent to us because of what the death of Christ actually was about. And what the death of Christ actually was about was God absorbing into his own experience the brokenness of his creatures and suffering with them in that brokenness, and being enabled to forgive the degree to which we contribute to that brokenness. And so that becomes clarified, I guess, in the work of the cross, so that God's forgiveness is the verse that people often use from Hebrews. There's no forgiveness without the shedding of blood, which makes it sound like the shedding of blood somehow earns that forgiveness. But again, I think within the sacrificial system, it was a matter of making visible a reality that's there rather than making it work. I guess the death of Christ is of that nature on steroids, I mean, writ large. Yeah, so I haven't quite got the language to explain it, but I think it's something around that. And when people have experiences of God, my brother at the moment is literally in the last stages of death. I mean, he could die any time. And his experience that he's having in this awful time when he's suffering, dreadful pain and all the rest of it, is just these waves of non-judgmental love sweeping from heaven towards him. And it's just like, because he's at the very threshold of life and death, like he sees through to what the other side is really like. And it's not this demanding God who wants to hurt in order to forgive first, punish in order to then say it's you're forgiven. But this God who's just unlimited in his love and forgiveness towards us. And the problem is much more on our side, being able to understand and receive that, than it is on God's side, how he manifests it. And again, the parable of the prodigal son is all about that. I mean, the word forgiveness doesn't occur in that parable, but I mean, when the father receives his son back, I mean, it's all about the son of mine who was lost has been found. I mean, it's not, he's become my son again. I mean, it's all about the transformation in the son. That's more important than the transformation in the father.
I am so interested in the distinctions between penal substitution and restorative justice theology or framework, because penal substitution is such a commonly held perspective. It seems like it just infuses into other parts of our lives and theology. And I don't think we have time to go into it too deeply because I have so many questions and we don't have heaps of time, but I was just wondering if you could speak to it briefly.
I think the kind of crude way of explaining it, which is the way I presented it earlier on, that God got this problem. Justice says I've got to punish, but my heart says I want to forgive, and Christ becomes the kind of the key to being able to do both. I mean, I think that's the way most people understand it, but there's so many problems with it, and I think one of the really fundamental problems is, what difference does punishment actually make? I mean, is it really, punishment doesn't change anything? I mean, there's a place for punishment in terms of reaffirming the kind of values that we hold. So that's a kind of symbolic way of reaffirming those values. And there's also a deeper sense in which when a person has caused suffering to others, they need to suffer in some way as well. There's a kind of equity there that I think is actually quite a profound moral requirement. But beyond that, punishment doesn't really change anything. And where does the resurrection fit in? I mean, it's to think that salvation depends on this cosmic act of punishment, I think doesn't work for me. It doesn't work logically. It doesn't work exegetically. There's, of course, a mystery about the cross. And I wouldn't want to say that this is an inappropriate set of categories to use, because I think the New Testament writers exhaust the lexicon looking for terms to try and use this. They use all kinds of ideas of paying debts and setting slaves free and punishment. All these kind of ideas are there, and they're all saying something that's important. And so I guess you want to say, well, what is it about the penal substitution model that's trying to uphold? But to see it as a necessary way of explaining the work of the cross is extremely limiting, and I think not terribly healthy, because what's happened is that model of justice then gets translated into ways of doing justice in the human sphere, and it turns God into a brute. I don't know, this God who has to exact pain in order to.
What do you do with the ideas of heaven and hell?
Well, heaven's not a problem. I mean, if by heaven you mean, God's dwelling place, the place where God's will is done perfectly, and that will eventually sort of merge with material creation, and God's will be done perfectly on earth as well as in heaven, then that's what it's all about. I mean, with hell, well, again, there are lots of different Christian positions on hell, and the one that I would reject most vigorously and emphatically is the idea of eternal suffering. And I do not actually know how people can believe in it without lying awake at night. The idea that God's justice requires eternal suffering is, to me, monstrous. And so I reject what is known as infernalism, the idea that there's this everlasting punitive pain inflicted on the lost is one I can't help but reject, root and branch, for moral as well as for other reasons. Another alternative is annihilationism, that the lost simply are cease to exist. It removes the problem of eternal suffering, but it still leaves God with the problem of having lost a good proportion of his creation. Or there's a kind of sense of universal salvation that eventually, when it says God will be all in all, it means God will be all in all, and that ultimately all that God has made will be restored. And I must say that I am drawn very strongly to that, but I don't want to either suggest God has to do that or to bypass the serious threats that are issued in the New Testament about the possibility of falling into a place where you miss out on what God intends. And I mean, I guess Christian theology, particularly in the East and in Catholicism, have this notion of purgatory where people go as a kind of reformatory school. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I've read a number of books recently around universalism, and even one around evangelical universalism. And I mean, theologically, I find it very persuasive, but there's still really serious warnings about the possibility of missing out. And I don't imagine it's a kind of purgatory, but I think we can't be too blasé about the fact that, you know, those who die in a position of fundamental rejection of goodness are not going to find the other side difficult. Whether that means they're forever lost, I don't know. I kind of think probably not, but I don't know. Yeah. The church has never settled on a single way of understanding the atonement. The creeds don't have any theology about this or any theories about it. You know, for us and for our salvation, he entered into life and died and rose again. It doesn't say the how, but it just says that it was. But I think even in the New Testament, there is no real explanation for how it worked. I mean, there's a lot of images, a lot of metaphors. Hebrews has got all those cultic metaphors of sacrifice, and there's slavery metaphors, and there's all kinds of different ways. And it's the way of putting it into an overarching theory came later. And the first fathers on this stuff prioritised the sort of slavery metaphor. In fact, the diagram that I've used, you can imagine a diamond. So what I say to the students is, why did we need saved? What are we being saved from? And why did we require what God has done in Christ? And it seems to me, if you draw a diamond, you think, here's the problem. The human problem is ignorance at the top. There is a sense of bondage at the bottom, and there's guilt and the shame. So it just teases them out. So, you know, we've fallen into a state of ignorance of reality. We're in a state of servitude, and this is the one that Paul really emphasises, that we're actually enslaved. And the symptoms of guilt and shame. And so you say, well, when you look at atonement theology, they've tended to come with a problem through one of these four doors. So, you know, penal substitution comes at it through the guilt door. The kind of moral influence theory that was elaborated in opposition to satisfaction theory comes up from the revelation door. God showed us how much he loved us in Christ, and the impact of that causes change. We're sort of persuaded by that. But I think the one that I would take, and what I said to them, two sort of presuppositions. One, it's best to approach through the servitude door, because that's the one that Paul most emphasises, and that's the problem. You know, dealing with guilt's not such a problem. The problem is setting people free so that they can actually live a different life. And then we think of the justice stuff as restorative justice, and then you try and measure the penal substitution model against that, and it doesn't really address the issue. Arguably, it addresses the issue of guilt, but it doesn't really address the issue of freedom or of restoration. So rather than kind of articulating a orthodox, one-off kind of explanation that everybody has to subscribe to, if you think of it, we've got these masses of problems. How does what Christ did affect each of these points? Then that's, I think, more helpful. But I do think the issue of being set free is the fundamental one that Paul uses in particular.
I really struggle with Paul, but I feel like...
You mustn't struggle with Paul. Paul is incredible. Honestly, I'm just working my way through in our little faith community, Galatians, and Paul is he is the most radical voice in the New Testament. You could even say he's more radical than Jesus. I mean, you could even say that because he faced issues that Jesus didn't face. He was carrying this gospel into the wider Greco-Roman world, and he faced issues about Jew and Gentile and slave and free and so on that weren't the kind of uppermost in Jesus' agenda. And Paul's radicalism, I mean, he would not be allowed to belong to most churches today because he is so, he's incredible. The problem with Paul is people read the hard bits and they take them out of context. They just see Paul as being, down on women or down on slaves or upholding the state. But the kind of context of those things make sense. He is just astonishing. I've studied taught Paul all my life, and even now when I'm trying to put the stuff together for a sermon, I think this is just Paul's attitude to the law. Is the thing the change in him that happened on the Damascus Road and the ramifications of that. So in Galatians he talks about. He's really angry in Galatians. He doesn't have anything nice about anybody in Galatians. He's really, really critical. He's critical of the conservative Jewish Christian voice in Jerusalem that was wanting these outsiders to conform to the Jewish way of life. And Paul will not have a bar of it. And he talks about this confrontation he had with Peter in Antioch, where he called Peter a hypocrite to his face because he had stopped eating with Gentile believers. Yeah, Paul's too hot to handle. How he's been turned into this conservative status quo kind of figure is incredible. In fact, I would say that I would say that Christians can't have a problem with Paul because what we think of Christianity is actually Pauline. The way that we've come to think about faith is fundamentally shaped by Paul. And so you can't say Jesus is not Paul and still have the same kind of shape to faith, I think. I mean, I could speak for 2 hours about this. Just the change in him that he went through from this rabid, persecuting Jewish nationalist to somebody who said, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free. Paul, have you read the Old Testament? He is amazing.
You briefly mentioned shame back when we were chatting about penal substitution. You mentioned shame, and I wanted to ask you about the role of pathological shame as a result of pejorative punishment. I listened to a lecture that you gave at Laidlaw College. I think I only listened to half of it, so I haven't finished it yet. But can you speak to how shame comes from punitive punishment and what alternatives restorative justice might offer?
Yeah, no, shame has been... I've spent some time recently looking at the issue of shame. I think I said at the beginning of the lecture, I've always known this is a kind of missing piece of the puzzle because atonement theology has largely been preoccupied with the issue of guilt. How is guilt dealt with? And we often see forgiveness as being only about guilt. And I've always known that there's a dimension of shame that's not the same as guilt, that shame and guilt aren't the same thing. Although they share a lot of things in common, they're both kind of negative self-awareness, if you like. And often they go together. You do something wrong, you often feel ashamed as well as feeling guilty, but they're not the same thing sort of fundamentally. And so I had an opportunity to do some more work on this. I was asked to contribute to a book, and I decided this is a good chance to do some more work around it. So it was really hard work to do. So the literature on shame, the psychology and anthropological literature is really quite vast. So, but just to try and go to the heart of what I said in that lecture, I mean, shame can be both healthy and unhealthy. It can be both chronic or toxic or pathological. So, I mean, the positive side of shame is important. I mean, it's a way of holding yourself accountable, I guess, to standards that you've fallen short of, and that feeling of self-rebuke is important. And the importance of it is best shown by looking at what a shameless person is like Donald Trump. I mean, who doesn't feel shame about anything? You realise that shame fulfills a really positive function in human experience. But there is also an unhealthy kind of shame. I think I call it toxic shame, which is a permanent state of feeling unworthy, of feeling that you are not the way you ought to be, and feeling fundamentally, I mean, polluted is the way that people often describe this experience of being fundamentally unclean, fundamentally flawed. It's pathological in the sense that it's a kind of ongoing disease or ongoing state that is crippling. And chronic shame, toxic shame or pathological shame, whatever you want to, persistent shame, whatever other we want to use it, when people suffer from that, it is a lifelong affliction that it's very difficult to address. And they tell us that experience of being saddled with this ongoing sense of failure and of unworthiness often goes back to early childhood experiences. Because, you know, where does our sense of being worth something come from? It primarily comes from the way our parents look at us and respond to us and affirm us and value us and care for us, and that, you know, that communicates this empathy which reinforces a sense of being a worthy individual. If that is interrupted in some way, if the child no longer either doesn't receive that, which is heartbreaking to think of that, but if they no longer receive that, or they receive mixed messages all the time, they very quickly internalise the sense that there's something wrong with me. You know, I'm not getting what I need. And so that can emerge long before they're aware of guilt. And guilt is a kind of moral judgment that comes much later in life. So it often goes back to that, or it can kick in from other experiences of being treated in a way that you're just a piece of garbage. And that can leave this ongoing sense that somehow I'm broken. And the problem with shame in terms of responding to it, and you get this sense in the Garden of Eden story with Adam and Eve, when they breached their relationship obligations and they ate from the tree, they went and hid themselves. And God said, "Where are you?" And they said, we hid ourselves because we were ashamed. And all the metaphors of fig leaves and all the rest of it. So the problem with shame is that it tends to mask its presence in our lives, and it can mask it psychologically through all sorts of other kind of behaviours that might be addictive behaviours, or it might be anxiety or anger, whatever. And you think that's a problem, but often underlying it, this deeper sense of somehow not being the sort of person that I ought to be. And it's been said that suicide is a kind of ultimate hiding mechanism of shame. You treat so much that you actually retreat from life itself. And so the question I ask is, how does the work of Christ address that problem? And particularly at a kind of global level. I mean, how does what Christ did and achieved in his life communicate to people that their shame is false or their shame has been lifted? And I guess fundamentally it communicates it by the sense that you are worth the cost that I paid in order to restore you. You know, that you're you're worth it. So in Jesus' ministry, he occupied his time with the most shamed parts of the population. You're worth it. He died the most shameful kind of death to symbolise his identification with his total attempt to obliterate a person's dignity. And he forgives. So, I think I say in the lecture, if you get to the end of it, that the therapists tell us that if you're dealing with a person who's struggling with shame, and toxic shame in particular, this abiding sense of shame, or maybe even a sense of moral shame, I've done something that I really can't talk about because I feel so bad about, that the key to addressing shame at a psychological and emotional level, they tell us, is empathy. So if you can empathise with that person and say, actually, you're not uniquely bad, you're worth me listening to, you're worth me spending my time. That empathy, as one writer puts it, is an adjudication of a person's worth. When you show empathy for somebody, you're saying you're worth my time. And in a sense, that's what the cross is, this divine empathy towards the human state of lostness and brokenness and valuelessness. And the word we use for divine empathy is the word grace. And if I was to ask you what does grace mean, I'm sure you'd probably give the standard response. Grace is unmerited favour. And as true, it is unmerited favour. But you can turn that into you don't merit it at all. You don't deserve this at all. But I'm going to show it anyway. But it's actually the reverse of that is that you are worth me showing you this mercy and love. It's grace is actually a paradoxical affirmation of our worthwhileness rather than worthlessness. It's worthwhile that I've done this for you. And nothing you've done, no secondary distinction, not your race or your gender or your class or your achievements or your sins or your whatever it is, none of that interferes with the fact that I think you're worth it. And so that surely is the deepest remedy for shame. If a person can feel that the source of all value in the universe says to you, you are worth it as a unique being, there's nobody else like you, you're worth restoring, then that must open the door to a sense of not being shamed, of being honoured by the source of all goodness. This is a really important really important insight. And I said when I wrote this paper, I said to one of my colleagues, I'd quite like to test drive this in a prison or something, because in prison's full of people who are being shamed. Because the whole criminal justice system is about public shaming. And we're good at shaming. We're really already good at shaming. Social media is all about shaming. We know how to do it. We know how to destroy a person's sense of value. We know how to exploit a person's vulnerability. We know how to make them feel that they don't count. We're really, really good at it. We're not so good at the reverse. We're not so good at lifting shame. We're not so good at conferring honour. We're not so good at adjudicating on somebody's utter worthwhileness. And so I think if a person can enter into an experience of divine love of that nature, then it's not going to fix all the ongoing struggles, but it must surely shift the dial to some degree. So I get this kind of way of thinking just touches on everything really, and it's why it is fundamentally a radical way of operating.
You've already mentioned that there is a role, though somewhat marginal, for punishment within restorative justice, within the restorative justice process. And I was just wondering if you could clarify how punishment fits in and where and what that looks like within the restorative justice framework.
When about 4 or 5 years ago, we ran a day workshop on bullying in schools and a restorative way of responding to bullying and online harm. And one of these kids expressed her understanding of punishment. She recognised that punishment is a kind of symbolic thing that you do, but the real work is not around the penalty. And so I think there is a role for punishment, although I hate the word, I just really don't like the word, but there is a role for imposing some kind of penalty which it serves two kinds of purposes. It serves the purpose of clarifying and reaffirming the kind of values that we hold as a community. So we do not accept that in our community you should steal or you should assault or you should rape or whatever. And the penalty is a kind of, and it's not just a verbal penalty, it's a serious kind of imposition on you to show that this is not what we value in our community. But it also, I think, serves a role around, and it took me a while to get there in my own thinking, but it serves a role around shared suffering as being part of the justice process. And so I think there is something about justice that says that when you have caused illegitimate suffering to another person for your own selfish ends, that for justice to occur, you have to participate in the pain that you have unleashed. I mean, Paul talks about the fellowship of his sufferings. I mean, there's a sense in which this is what Christ does and enter into our situation and share our suffering. And I think what punishment as a social institution does is kind of impose that suffering. But in itself, that's not enough. What really needs to happen is a person needs through that to actually personally enter into the reality of the pain they've caused and bear the cost of trying to put it right. And so I think a restorative process can do that as well, because it's the same kind of shared suffering. So I think that I'm not an abolitionist when it comes to the social institution of punishment, but I am a skeptic about how much it achieves in and of itself. But the reality of the fact that pain has to be shared in order for it to be dissipated, I think, is quite a profound insight.
In your experience in the criminal justice system and working in restorative justice, what has been a source of hope for you in some of that?
I mean, in terms of hope, I have two ways of answering this question about hope, because I think there is a kind of fundamental set of beliefs that as a Christian are the source of hope. We can maybe come to that in a moment. But I think in the restorative work or in any process where harm is being addressed in a restorative way, what gives me hope is the enormous capacity that human beings have to be kind to each other. There's a kind of reverence for humanity that I get out of this process, that people are capable of so much understanding, of so much compassion, of so much mercy, of so much regret. I mean, it's just, I think that is a source of hope. I mean, as a Christian, I think God is anonymously present in the room, but it's not a process that requires any kind of religious belief or any kind of other qualification except a willingness to face into the pain. And when people face into the pain and they do it together, and empathy flows, as it instinctively does for most. I mean, there's, again, exceptions, of course, but when you see that flow, you do feel you are on holy ground. I mean, you really do. That's an enormous source of hope, really. At a larger kind of level, I mean, I think hope is a rare commodity in our current situation, and for understandable reasons, and it's easy to be quite despairing about our future. And so what does it mean to be hopeful in the face of that and not to be trivial and to trivialize the situation? So I recently gave some lectures on hope, and I think there are two things in the New Testament that are the source of hope. One is confidence in God's unfailing faithfulness. In Romans 4, when Paul told the story of Abraham and being promised heirs, even though he was heirless, what he responded to with hope was the fact that God was faithful, God could do this. So I think Christian hope is based ultimately in the faithfulness of God. And it's also based in the evidence of that through the resurrection of Jesus, which is something that transcends the negativity of death. And so the fact, I guess, as a Christian, my hope is built on nothing less than how does the rest of it go?
Jesus Christ and his righteousness.
Yeah, and shown by the triumph of the resurrection. I mean, So one of the things about hope, I did some research around sort of hope because philosophers are talking a lot about hope, understandably. And they distinguish between hope and optimism. So optimism is a kind of almost certainty about the future. So when you say, I hope I'm going to pass this exam, or I'm optimistic about passing my exams, you think it's pretty well certain. When you speak of hope, it kind of there's a degree of uncertainty. I hope, but I'm not too sure, okay? When the New Testament speaks of hope, it speaks of it as a certainty. And so the hope we have is a source of certainty. Now, where does that certainty reside? Well, it resides in the fact that God does not fail, and it resides in the fact that the evidence of that has been shown in the resurrection of Christ, which means that the great annihilation of meaning, which is death, has been transcended. And so, of all people, we should be the most hopeful, without us slipping into a kind of naive optimism, because hope is also very costly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it was costly for Jesus and for God to actually work at restoring creation. I mean, it cost everything. And I think the hope that we hold on to doesn't mean that we are spared the cost of the damage that we're doing to the climate or the damage we do to each other. And who knows quite what the cost is going to be to try and overcome the damage that we are doing. I mean, we seem to be on a suicidal path at the moment, and how that works out, who knows? But that can't be a source of despair if what we believe as Christians is true, and God so loved the world. So that's what gives me hope. I mean, the evidence of God's presence in people, the reality of love. I mean, if you talk to people about why they don't believe in God, I guarantee that they'll say, "What about all the pain in the world?" So, theology is explaining or defending the existence of God over against the presence of evil and suffering in the world. Understandable, but I wish I could think of a term that would sort of put the other side of the picture. Is how do you explain the presence of love and the power of love? And how do you explain the beauty of the world? How do you explain this human capacity to sort of transcend suffering? Is not that the ultimate reality? So, I get tremendous hope out of seeing love at work in all its forms.
What do you think your most controversial opinion is? If you were in a room with a bunch of other people from your field, what do you think is something that you would most likely disagree with them about?
Well, I guess I've got two fields. I mean, the field of restorative justice, I can't think of anything that I would disagree with, anything of significance. I mean, there's sort of definitional disagreements. Maybe the role of forgiveness in the process, the role of reconciliation in the process, the need to hold on to, to the relationality as opposed to a sort of simple practice that you use. But that wouldn't be a matter of disagreement. I think in the theological area, I guess the stuff we talked about around atonement and around final destiny and so on has certainly been something people have been quite critical about in terms of my views. And but there are other audiences where the fact that you still believe in God, or you still believe in miracles, or you still believe in discipleship, that could be something they might struggle with. So it just really depends. I kind of feel that everything I believe is perfectly orthodox. So it's just, and I don't know why sometimes I have been held at arm's length by people I would have thought, actually, I'm totally on your side. But it used to be when I was a younger guy, and in the Christian community, a lot of debate was going on around gender inclusion and sort of equality and so on. And hopefully that argument's been pretty well won. So, and that's the thing about as you get older, you realise that the things that people get really hit up about are really just a phase, and things that people feel are life and death issues now, 10, 20, 30 years seem kind of, why did we ever get worried about that? When I think of the current state of the Christian community, certainly in this country and in the West more generally, I think we are going through a pretty major stripping down of the church, if you like, or the role that we have played in society, and we are, I think, increasingly occupying this marginal position, and one in which there is a great deal of hostility to what Christians believe and do, and we brought a lot of that on our own heads by our behaviour. That as the church sort of gets stripped back down to basics, the things that we have used to distinguish us from each other become pretty meaningless, really, because whole denominations have been created over fine details of theology that ultimately don't really matter. And I think as a church becomes taken back to its origins and to its basics, then we will find a unity in following Jesus that means that my views won't be controversial anymore. And then you're talking about hope, and I think that's a big question of what is there to hope for in the church today, because I think that I cannot imagine the church in 30 years' time even looking like what it does today, and what it looks like today does not look anything like it did 30 years ago. And you can either feel very despairing about that, you can either think the church is somehow, on its way out, Christian faith has been discredited and all the rest of it, or you can say what is going on is we're giving up all the power and all the prestige and all the self-evident virtue that we used to have, and we're finding again what it means to follow a radical prophet on the edge.
We also always ask, what books are you reading at the moment, and what sort of books have been formational for you in your study and work that you would recommend to us to read?
I think in Restorative Justice, the book I'd still recommend is the first book that they've written in the field, called Changing Lenses, and it's into its fourth or fifth edition now. But I still think that is a book that identifies the kind of heartbeat around this work. There's a lot of more technical criminological texts around, but I still think Changing Lenses is a book that changed me, and I think is still an important book. In terms of other reading, one of the virtues of being retired or semi-retired is I can read whatever I like, and it's quite diverse. I do read a lot of New Testament theology books. It's still, I guess, the thing that most stirs my heart. I'm currently reading a book about, what's it called? Something about the Holy Mountain. It's a book about sort of minority Christian communities in the Middle East, and how the birthplace of Christianity in the Middle East, is increasingly being stripped of Christian communities through immigration and persecution and so on. So I read another book about sort of Eastern Orthodox spirituality, which is kind of quite different. I read quite a bit, I guess you could call it philosophical theology. That sounds a bit grandiose, but I've read quite a few books of David Bentley Hart. Does that name mean anything to you? I've read 4 or 5 of his books, and he writes a lot. He's one of the rudest writers you can come across. He's really critical of everybody that doesn't see things his way. His book on atheist delusions, is it? A response to the new atheists is, it's searing in his critique, and very perceptive. But the most recent couple of books of his I read one called The Experience of God, and the subtitles are Consciousness, Beauty and Bliss, I think. So he uses the experience of consciousness, which is a great mystery to scientists, of course. Where does this come from? The experience of beauty and the experience of transcendence, I guess, of bliss, as the avenues from which we experience God. And it's a very profound book. he's written a book which is a kind of novel. It's an unusual book called, I actually wrote it down so I didn't forget the name because it's about his dog. Roland and Moonlight. So it's a book where he has this kind of ongoing conversation with his dog about philosophical issues and theological issues, and towards the end it gets quite what's the word? I mean, he's been accused of syncretism because he really all claims, and I think fundamentally he's probably right, that all the great religious traditions at their best are talking about the same kind of experience of transcendence. And so he's he knows a lot about a lot of things that I don't know much about at all. And he gets into that sort of space, and it's really quite weird. So I enjoy reading him. I sometimes get a bit irritated by his style, which is quite, it's very polemical. He's got his own translation of the New Testament. He's withering in his criticism of Tom Wright's translation of the New Testament. He hates it, and he probably hates Tom Wright. And so, I mean, I think you could say, I mean, again, it's probably a bit too simplistic, but I think, he comes at the translation issues and at the sort of tradition really from the perspective of Greek learning, whereas Tom Wright is very informed by sort of Second Temple Judaism and its context, and so there's a wee bit of a difference. I mean, there's always been this kind of division between those who approach the New Testament through a Greco-Roman lens and those who approach it through a Second Temple Jewish lens, although they're increasingly seen as both overlapping realities. But I think that may be part of it. But his translation, he wants it to be as rough and as confronting as he thinks it should be, whereas he sees Tom Wright more about sort of smoothing it, making it more accessible and more. But I mean, again, when they write about each other, I mean, it's just brutal. Brutal. It really is. It accuses Tom Wright of not really knowing his Greek. So, but you can't help but be stimulated by his outlook.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was so awesome to chat with you.
Very good to talk.
Thank you for your time.